It was supposed to be the perfect crime. In 2016, a group of hackers came within a hair's breadth of stealing nearly $1 billion from a central bank, one of the biggest heists in history. They had a genius plan, nerves of steel, and they were just moments away from success. And then, it all fell apart because of a typo. Yes, you heard that right. A simple spelling mistake stopped them in their tracks. Sounds unbelievable, doesn't it? How could a mere typo thwart a $1 billion robbery? Imagine the scene. High-stakes cyber criminals manipulating bank systems from the shadows, millions of dollars being wired across the globe in minutes, and nobody noticing at first. The hackers are grinning in anticipation. Their plan is working better than they'd hoped. But suddenly, one transaction gets flagged. Alarms of suspicion go off, all because of a single misspelled word. In that instant, the hackers' nearly flawless victory turns into a frantic retreat. This is the story of how the world's most expensive typo saved almost $1 billion from ending up in the wrong hands. Buckle up, because this tale of cybercrime and a tiny mistake is as thrilling as any Hollywood heist. Except, it really happened. How did we get here? Let's rewind a bit and set the stage for this incredible true story. Our story begins in Bangladesh, a South Asian country with a bustling capital city, Dhaka. In the heart of Dhaka stands Bangladesh Bank, the country's central bank. If you're not familiar with what a central bank does, think of it as the government's bank. It holds the country's money reserves and manages the currency and monetary policy. Bangladesh Bank, like many central banks, keeps a lot of its money, particularly foreign currency like US dollars, in accounts overseas for international trade and payments. In fact, Bangladesh Bank had billions of dollars on deposit at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. This is common practice. Central banks often park their foreign currency reserves in big, secure institutions abroad. After all, you need US dollars on hand to settle trades or pay for imports. Those reserves are a huge, tempting treasure for anyone daring enough to try to steal them. But you can't just walk into the New York Fed and withdraw money from someone else's account. Transferring funds from a central bank's account is a bit more complex and supposedly secure. Banks around the world rely on a system called SWIFT to move money internationally. SWIFT stands for the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, but all you need to know is that it's like the messaging network that banks use to say, "Hey, please transfer this money to this account." It's the backbone of global finance, a digital highway for trillions of dollars in transactions. When Bangladesh Bank wants to send money from its New York Fed account to, say, another country's bank, it sends a secure SWIFT message with all the details. These messages are like highly encrypted digital orders that tell banks where to send funds. Every instruction has to be just right. Correct codes, correct names, correct amounts. Otherwise, things don't go through. Normally, this system is very reliable and safe. Normally. By early 2016, however, trouble was brewing. Unbeknownst to Bangladesh Bank, some very patient and skilled criminals had found a crack in the armor. This bank was a prime target, sitting on nearly $1 billion of accessible funds, and the attackers were about to exploit it in a way no one expected. To understand how, we need to look at how these hackers planned the heist of the century. This wasn't a smash-and-grab bank robbery with masks and guns. It was a slow, methodical cyber break-in. Sometime in January 2016, hackers managed to infiltrate Bangladesh Bank's computer systems. Think of it like digital burglars sneaking around the bank's network at night. They likely got in through malware, malicious software, possibly through a phishing email or an infected website. Once inside, they didn't start stealing immediately. They hid in the network, spying quietly on how the bank did business. For weeks, the hackers watched the staff's routines, learned how the bank formatted its SWIFT transfer requests, and found out where the guardrails were. They were looking for the perfect time to strike and the perfect loopholes to exploit. They found one: the timing of Bangladesh's weekend. In Bangladesh, the weekend falls on Friday and Saturday, different from the Western Saturday-Sunday weekend. This meant that by Thursday night, the offices at Bangladesh Bank would shut down and not reopen until Sunday. The hackers planned to execute their theft late on Thursday, right when the weekend began and no one was around to immediately notice or respond. Timing was crucial. If they sent fraudulent transfer requests on Friday, a weekend day in Bangladesh. It would still be within working hours on Friday in New York, because of the time zone difference. The Federal Reserve in New York would be open and could process the transactions, while Bangladesh Bank's offices in Dhaka were dark and empty. No one back home would see the alerts in real time. It was the perfect window of opportunity. These criminals had prepared meticulously. They obtained the credentials, like secret codes and passwords, needed to send swift messages from Bangladesh Bank. Essentially, they managed to pose as legitimate bank officers and create what looked like authentic transfer orders. They weren't sending just 1 or 2 requests either. They went big. Nearly 36 transfer requests were lined up, one after the other. In total, if all of them succeeded, the hackers would drain about $951 million from Bangladesh Bank's New York Fed account. That is close to $1 billion, virtually all the money available. This was all or nothing. Now, you might wonder, where was this money going to go? The hackers weren't stupid. They weren't sending it straight to their own personal bank accounts. Instead, they set up accounts in other countries as getaway vehicles for the funds. They chose accounts in the Philippines and Sri Lanka for this heist. In the Philippines, they had arranged 4 bank accounts at a Philippine bank called RCBC, Rizal Commercial Banking Corporation. These accounts were opened months earlier and sat dormant, waiting for a big payday. The hackers used fake identities for these, so if anyone traced the money to those accounts, it would point to people who don't really exist or low-level money mules. There was also a transfer plan to Sri Lanka to an organization called the Shalika Foundation. On paper, it looked like a charitable foundation in Sri Lanka was about to get a generous $20 million donation. In reality, that organization was likely a front. It turned out later that no registered NGO named Shalika Foundation even existed in Sri Lanka. The hackers had set up all the receiving accounts carefully to avoid immediate suspicion. Everything was set. On the night of February 4, 2016, just as Bangladesh Bank staff clocked out for the weekend, the hackers moved. They started sending their fraudulent SWIFT instructions to the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. In the silent, empty halls of Bangladesh Bank, these transfer requests went out unnoticed, one after another after another. Dozens of messages telling the New York Fed to transfer money out of Bangladesh Bank's account into those accounts in the Philippines and Sri Lanka. For a little while, it looked like the plan was working flawlessly. No alarms were going off in Dhaka. The hackers had even tampered with the bank's printers, so that the usual hard copy printouts of transfer orders were delayed. The bank had a printer that automatically prints out records of SWIFT transactions. The hackers made sure it wouldn't print out their bogus transfers right away, buying them more time. Money began moving out. In New York, the Fed started processing the requests because they appeared to be legitimate instructions from Bangladesh's central bank. The hackers likely watched with excitement as millions of dollars flowed into the Philippine accounts they set up. $20 million, $30 million, $50 million. The total climbed to about $101 million sent out in just a matter of hours. This was really happening. If all went according to their plan, by the end of the weekend, they would have nearly $1 billion scattered to secret accounts, ready to disappear into the ether. But remember, they had almost 36 requests in total. As these kept flooding in, some bankers and systems on the other side of the world began to raise their eyebrows. The volume of transactions coming from Bangladesh Bank was highly unusual, especially since many were directed to private entities, like a supposed charity and personal accounts, rather than other banks. At the New York Fed, red flags started popping up. Imagine working at the Fed and suddenly seeing 30 requests to move massive sums out of a country's central bank account, some to individual beneficiaries. It would feel like something's not right. Even though the hackers had done their homework, the sheer scale of the transfers was out of the ordinary. Then came the critical moment. Among those many transfer orders was one instructing $20 million to the Shalika Foundation in Sri Lanka. That one little transaction would become the hackers' undoing. Why? Because in crafting that particular instruction, the criminals made a tiny but fatal mistake. They misspelled the recipient's name. And that brings us to the twist in our story, the typo that saved the day. One word, 14 letters. That was the difference between the hackers nearly getting away with $1 billion and having their heist exposed. The word was supposed to be foundation, as in Shalika Foundation, the fake Sri Lankan entity set to receive $20 million. But when the hackers typed it into the transfer form, they accidentally wrote "foundation." Perhaps it was a slip of the finger, a rushed typing job, or maybe they weren't as familiar with English spelling. Whatever the reason, Shalika Foundation does not look right, and it didn't to the banks processing the transfer either. This misspelling set off alarm bells. The $20 million transfer had to pass through an intermediary bank, Deutsche Bank, which was helping route the money to Sri Lanka. At Deutsche Bank, an officer spotted the odd spelling "foundation." Imagine seeing a huge payment to an NGO you've never heard of, with a name that's clearly misspelled. It screams suspicious. Deutsche Bank didn't just shrug and process it. They paused. They reached out to Bangladesh Bank for clarification. Basically, they asked, "Hey, is this beneficiary name correct? We have Shalika Foundation, is that right?" But Bangladesh Bank at that moment had no idea what Deutsche Bank was talking about. Remember, it was the weekend in Bangladesh and the offices were closed. No one was answering promptly. The hackers had counted on that silence, but in this case, the silence worked against them. The request was now in limbo, awaiting confirmation. And because Deutsche Bank raised a red flag on that typo, the $20 million did not immediately go through. In fact, it was stopped entirely before it could reach the fake foundation. The typo had effectively tripped the wire. Now the dominoes started to fall. The unusual pause and query from Deutsche Bank likely made the Federal Reserve in New York even more suspicious about all the other transfers flowing out. On top of that, by this time, a number of the hackers' transfer requests, totaling around $850 million, had been flagged and held back by the Fed for manual review. The Fed was already uneasy because of the volume and destinations of these requests. The foundation mistake just provided concrete proof that something fishy was going on. Early the next week, when Bangladesh bank officials finally saw the messages and the printer belatedly spit out the records of what had been happening, panic hit. Can you imagine coming into work and discovering that someone tried to steal nearly $1 billion from right under your nose? The officials scrambled to figure out what was happening. They got Deutsche Bank's message about Shalika Foundation and knew immediately something was wrong, because there was no Shalika Foundation authorized to get any money. The bank swiftly alerted authorities and sent out urgent messages to stop payment on all the suspicious transfers. Thanks to that one misspelling, the biggest transfers were blocked in time. The typo had saved about $850 million from vanishing. It's pretty incredible when you think about it. If the hackers had typed "foundation" correctly, that $20 million might have slipped through without question, just like the other payments to the Philippines. And if that one hadn't raised the alarm, the remaining $850 million of pending transfers might have been sent out before anyone caught on. In other words, a single letter prevented an even greater disaster. It's not every day that a spelling error in a bank document ends up stopping criminals and not causing a mistake. Truly the most valuable typo in the world. While the typo stopped the bulk of the theft, this story doesn't have a perfectly happy ending. The hackers still got away with a significant amount of money. About $81 million had already been successfully transferred to the Philippines before everything was shut down. That's a fortune in its own right, one of the largest bank thefts ever, even if it's much less than what they originally aimed for. So, what happened to all that money? The $81 million that landed in the Philippines was split into 4 bank accounts at RCBC as planned. From there, it was quickly converted and moved through a money laundering maze. The thieves were crafty. They funneled the funds into local casinos in Manila. Why casinos? At that time, the Philippines' casinos were not fully covered by strict money laundering laws, which made them an ideal place to clean large amounts of dirty money. In the casinos, the money could be turned into chips, gambled or claimed as winnings, and then reconverted into seemingly legitimate cash. By the time investigators started tracking the trail, much of that $81 million had vanished into the casino industry and beyond, some even reportedly making its way to Hong Kong. It was a financial vanishing act on a grand scale. Bangladesh Bank was desperate to recover the stolen funds. They immediately contacted authorities in the Philippines, and the Philippines Anti-Money Laundering Council jumped in to investigate. There were Senate hearings in the Philippines, bank officials were grilled, and a few people were eventually charged for facilitating the laundering. A branch manager at RCBC who oversaw the accounts was among those found responsible and later convicted of money laundering. The Philippine bank even faced hefty fines and a lot of embarrassment for its role in the caper. Slowly, a portion of the money was traced and recovered. Roughly $15 million was eventually returned to Bangladesh, a fraction of the total. The $20 million meant for Sri Lanka was fully recovered because that transfer had been stopped in time. But tens of millions were still missing. As of today, a large chunk of the $81 million remains unrecovered, having disappeared into the shadows of the international financial system. On the Bangladesh side, the fallout was intense. The heist exposed glaring weaknesses in the bank's cybersecurity. It was frankly shocking that hackers could penetrate a central bank's network and waltz out with that much money. An embarrassed Bangladesh bank governor faced harsh criticism and ultimately resigned not long after the incident. The bank brought in forensic investigators, including a cybersecurity firm and Mandiant, a famed cyber forensics team, to comb through what happened. They discovered the malware the hackers left behind and traced how the attackers had lurked in the system. Investigators noted that the hackers had deep knowledge of the bank's operations, suggesting they may have had help from an insider or spent a long time gathering intel. There was also a bit of diplomatic and legal sparring. Bangladesh's government was angry that the Federal Reserve Bank of New York didn't catch and stop all those bogus transfers immediately. Bangladesh bank officials even considered suing the Fed to get the rest of their money back, implying that the Fed should have flagged the transactions sooner. The New York Fed, on its part, stated that its systems weren't compromised and that it followed proper procedures, and it pointed out that the SWIFT instructions had valid security credentials. Essentially, the Fed said, "We had no way to know they were fake requests at first." It was a blame game born out of frustration. After all, when $81 million is missing, everyone looks for someone to hold accountable. And what about the hackers who pulled off this scheme? They covered their tracks well. The Bangladesh officials and international investigators admitted it would be very difficult to catch the perpetrators. These weren't amateurs in a basement. They were likely a highly organized group operating across borders. In fact, later evidence pointed toward a shadowy state-sponsored hacking group known as Lazarus, believed to be linked to North Korea. The same group has been accused of other high-profile cyber attacks, like the Sony Pictures hack in 2014 and global ransomware incidents. If true, it means a nation-state was possibly behind the Bangladesh bank heist, using cybercrime to obtain funds. North Korea, under heavy sanctions, has been suspected of orchestrating bank hacks to steal money, and this was right up their alley. In 2018, the U.S. Department of Justice even indicted a North Korean programmer in connection with this case. Still, the people who actually typed "foundation" into that transfer remain at large. They nearly pulled off an unprecedented theft, and even though they stumbled, they still made off with a huge payday. The Bangladesh bank heist of 2016 is a thriller of a tale, a high-tech robbery that was inches away from becoming the largest bank theft ever. In the end, the plot was foiled not by high-tech cyber defenses or crack police work, but by something far more ordinary, a spelling error. It's ironic and almost comical. The hackers spent months planning every detail, but one typo cost them almost $900 million. That has to go down in history as the world's most expensive typo. This story has a strong payoff. It reminds us that in our digital age, sometimes the smallest details can have the biggest consequences. A single letter prevented a billion-dollar crime. It wasn't advanced artificial intelligence or a giant security system that saved the day. It was human fallibility, the hacker's mistake, and human attentiveness, the bank staff who noticed the odd spelling. In a way, it's comforting to know that criminals can mess up in such simple ways. But it's also a wake-up call. We can't count on luck or mistakes to protect us from cyber thieves in the future. Financial institutions worldwide took this incident as a cautionary tale. After the heist, banks everywhere double-checked their security, and the SWIFT network urged banks to bolster their systems and verify unusual transfer requests more rigorously. It was a stark demonstration that even a central bank with billions in reserves could be vulnerable to a clever attack. For everyday people, it's a hint at just how much of our money moves through unseen digital pathways, where a clever hacker, or a tiny typo, can change everything in an instant. In the end, the Bangladesh bank hackers learned an expensive lesson. Detail matters. That one typo flipped their victory into defeat. And for the rest of us, the tale of the Shalika Foundation is something we won't forget. A bizarre but true example of how a small error can have world-changing effects. Next time you double-check your spelling, remember, it might not save $1 billion, but it can't hurt. Sometimes the biggest fails come from the smallest mistakes, and in this case, that little mistake was all that stood between a group of criminals and an almost $1 billion jackpot. Crazy, isn't it?